All right. Hi, welcome back. So this is where we left things off last time, right? So we had a website that did things for us. We could change the random color, we can toggle images on the site. All of that is great and good, and it kind of highlights some of the power of JavaScript, but it's not particularly practical. So today I wanted to try and get something a little bit more practical, something that you can actually include in your websites, right? And that will actually be an example of how JavaScript is used in the real world. So we are going to build a gallery. Okay, so let's close all the stuff. This was a mobile view of our site. We're actually not going to be using this page anymore, and we're going to go back to our uh, repository, right? And we're going to add a new page here. Okay, it's going to be gallery.html. Okay, so we can, as always, start with just an exclamation point and an empty HTML document, and that will give us the Emmet abbreviation and give us the template. So let's put in gallery for the name, right? And then we can also go back to our index and borrow some of the components that we have pre-made there, right? So first of all, style sheet, right? We added some decent styles. We can reuse them, right? So let's go to our gallery and let's insert the style sheet. And then we can also reuse the header. The only thing is that we are going to need to add one more link to the header, right? So li and then a href, and that's going to be gallery.html, right? And then gallery over here. So that's going to be the updated header, and we can copy and paste this into our gallery as well, right? So the only problem is that now the anchors that we used, we also have to specify the name of the file to which those anchors belong, right? So we're gonna add index.html anchor home, index.html anchor about, and index.html anchor contact, right? So that means that our menus are going to be different here on this page and on this page, and I'm just going to leave it as an unresolved issue. There are ways to resolve this issue, but we're basically just going to say, well, it's kind of a bit of an issue. One way to solve it would be to just constantly copy and paste things as we're updating them. There's also a way to automate it, right? But that's an entirely different conversation. All right, so we have a gallery, we have a page, we have a header, and let's add the main container, right? Save this main container, and then let's load this. Let's see what our page looks like right now. So let's copy the path, paste this into the browser, and see what we got. All right, we have home, about, contact, gallery. Fantastic. Let's inspect this. Is it still responsive? It's still responsive. It still works. It's just that our main container is empty, which is, all good. As expected. It's all great. So, all right. So in the main, I am going to have the following. I'm going to have a list of thumbnails. I'm going to have 4 of them. I prepared 4 images of Quokkas, right? In my image folder, I have gallery 1, gallery 2, gallery 3, and gallery 4. So all those are images. I just downloaded them from the internet and prepped them a little bit just so that they're all the same size. They're all 960 by 960 pixels, right? And so I am going to be creating like a row of thumbnails, right? And then when you click on one of those thumbnails, this image is going to be displayed large in the main sort of display element. Okay, so let's build this out. So I am going to have an unordered list. It's going to be a UL, right? And then I'm going to have a list item of or a series of list items in it. So li, right? And I'm gonna have 4 since I have 4 images. So I'm just gonna copy and propagate this 4 times. So the UL is gonna get a class, right? It will be helpful. Class will be thumbnails. Okay. And then each of the list items is also going to get a class, right? So we're going to get class equals gallery thumb, something like this, right? So we're going to copy and paste the class to all of them, okay? And then finally, let's insert an image into every one of them. So we're going to have img source images, right? And then gallery 1, and then alt. We need an alt, and it's going to be a gallery image of a quokka. So let's just say that gallery image of a quokka, right? And that's that. So they're going to be all very similar. So I'm going to copy and paste them like this. And I'm just going to change gallery 1, gallery 2, gallery 3, and gallery 4. So that's as far as the structure goes. And then I'm going to have underneath a div. And div is a very generic class, generic element. Is basically just a division, a compartment on the page, right? Div and its class is going to be image showcase, right? So it's going to contain the image that's actually going to contain, that's going to showcase the selected thumbnail. Okay, so let's do something like this: image source, right? Gallery 1, and then instead of saying a gallery image of a quokka, we're gonna say showcase, right? Showcase image of a quokka, something like this. Okay, so prep work is done. Let's close this and let's close that. So time to write our script. So last time we saw that we can add script at the end of the body, right? So you would add a script tag. And then the way we did this last time, we kind of just started writing JavaScript here, right? But just like with CSS, we would encounter an issue that, like, as our HTML grows and as our JavaScript grows, everything will start getting very unruly. So just like with CSS, we can link external files for our scripts. So we can just say script source, and the source for the script is going to be, let's go script.js. That's going to be the name of our file. Okay, so again, in here, I want to make sure that I'm on the same level, because the rules of URLs, or the rules of link navigation, still applies, right? I'm going to create script.js. It's on the same level as my gallery file. And I am going to be using split screen coding again. I don't need an Explorer anymore. Let's save this. All right, excellent. So we are ready to start. Let's save this again. Let's again just double check, making sure that things are working. All right, so I have 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the main showcase. Fantastic. So first, a little bit of CSS, right? So let's open over here CSS and let's format our gallery properly, right? Style.css is here, and I'm just going to be appending my gallery styles to the existing styles, right? So this unordered list, right, needs some just basic adjustment, right? Nothing too crazy, right? So let's reference our list by its class, thumbnails, right? And we just want to make sure that all the elements are kind of like nicely sitting together as a row. We've already seen the Flexbox strategy, and when we talked about CSS, so we're going to use the same exact strategy, right? So I'm going to add gallery styles over here, comment this out, and let's start writing things for the gallery. Okay, so dot thumbnails. Okay, that's going to be our unordered list. So if you remember, unordered lists come with pre-built styles in with the browser. So like padding, right? So let's set padding to 0, right? And then let's set list style to none. Okay. And then let's do display flex. And then we said that just remembering from our CSS example, let's do flex direction, right? And the flex direction is going to be a row. Okay. All right. Let's see if that's enough. By the tone, you probably guessed that it's not quite, right? So it's kind of there, but I also wanted to add one more component here, and that is flex wrap, no wrap, right? So I don't want to wrap for one very simple reason, is because I want to add a little bit of padding so that, see how they're all kind of like tucking onto each other, right? So I wanted to add a little bit of padding to every component, right? So let's add the padding, and you'll see why I want to set the no wrap. So dot thumbnails li padding, and let's do padding of 8 pixels. Padding of 8 pixels. Ooh, misspelled. Great. So save. Now, if I add the padding, right? They're all separated. I want to make sure that if they grow for whatever reason, right? If this element it becomes a little bit bigger or something comes between them or something, they don't, like, let's imagine in the layout, what if I add a margin instead of padding? A little bit more, right? They kind of start separating. I want to make sure that this one doesn't start tucking in underneath, right? So it's a precautionary measure, something that I just like to do just to make sure that I definitely have them in the row. See, like flex wrap will allow them to go underneath. No wrap, I believe, is the default. And I am just trying to be super duper extra careful and say like, no, under no circumstances I don't want them to start wrapping on a new line. I always want them to be in one line. So let's set this to no wrap. Okay. All set and done. All right. So now let's also add a little bit of padding to the showcase image, right? So that they're all aligned properly, right? So let's do .img showcase, right? This div showcase. We're gonna also have a padding of 8 pixels, right? So that they're all aligned. Excellent. All right, so now the functionality. So I want to be able to click on every single one of these images and showcase it here, right? So we already saw kind of how to do this when we created in the examples in the previous video, when we toggled our source for the image, right? Like either one or the other. So this is maybe a little bit more complicated than what we did, but not by much. Okay. All right, so let's write out the JavaScript. So I would need to reference every single one of these thumbnails, right? And I would need to reference this big showcase element. Okay, so I would need to give them IDs, right? That's how we did it last time. That's how we're gonna do it today. I'm gonna first show you that strategy, and then I'm gonna show you maybe a slightly more efficient way of doing this, right? That's gonna be a little bit more helpful. But let's start from the start. So I'm gonna give them all IDs. ID, gallery thumb. Since IDs have to be unique, right? I'm gonna give them numbers. So it's ID gallery thumb 1, gallery thumb 2, gallery thumb, this will be 3, and this will be 4. So let's switch them, 3 and 4. Okay, so they have unique IDs, and now this element will also have a unique ID, and that's going to be showcase image. Okay, fantastic. So now let's go to our script and let's create the references, right? So we decided not to use consts. You know, it's whatever that decision. Pros and cons of it can be debated, but we decided to just use let to denote our variables, and let's just go with that. So we're going to say let gt1, gallery thumb 1, is equal to, right? So we're getting document to get element by ID, and then we need to provide the ID, and the ID is going to be gallery thumb 1. Ooh, misspelled. Yeah, pay attention to spelling. As always, very important. Okay, so and now we basically just need to do that same thing 3 more times, right? It's going to be GT1, GT2, GT3, GT4, and then it's going to be thumb 1, thumb 2, thumb 3, and thumb 4. Okay, so we have all 4 thumbnails, right? And then we are going to reference our main image, right? The showcase image, right? So let's do let sc showcase image is document.get element by ID. No, it's not screen image. That's wrong. Showcase image. Okay, so hopefully there are no spelling mistakes. We should be all set. And now, again, if you remember, we need to add an event listener, right? So we're going to say that GT1, GT2, GT3, GT4, they're all going to have event listeners. So let's do it. GT1, nope, GT1, add event listener, click, and then I'm going to have them all trigger the same function. So I'm going to have a function called change image, right? And that's what we're going to be triggering. So they're all going to be doing the same thing. If this repetition is starting to get a little tedious, that's great. There's a fantastic paradigm in programming that says do not repeat yourself. If you're repeating something over and over and over again, there must be an easier way of doing things. And I'll show you what that easier way is, right? It might require another level of abstraction, but it's going to be faster and easier, and you're not going to have to copy and paste all that much. But for now, let's just stick to this and let's make sure that we get the main thing going, right? So change image is going to take an argument. So remember how last time, again, we talked about how some functions take arguments and some functions do not, right? So like a random function doesn't take an argument, it just generates a random number and doesn't need any additional parameters, right? But something like a function called get element by ID does require a parameter, right? And that's what's the ID that you're trying to access. So our change image function is also going to require a parameter. So I am going to supply it with the default parameter, which is event. So whenever you trigger the function right here, it has the ability to access the event that triggered it, right? So I'm gonna access this event by supplying it here. So we'll call it event. It doesn't matter what you call it, as long as it's the first parameter that you're trying to access, right? So more important. I'm getting lost a little bit in the assistance messages, but okay, so we're gonna have an event right here, and then we're gonna close this. Perfect. And then we're gonna access, not, let's just do console.log event. So this is super helpful usually to just look at things as they are, right? So it's helpful for us to just console log what that event is and see, what did we do? What are we even dealing with here? Okay, so just kind of like open the hood and start kind of poking around where things are connected and what do they look like. Okay, just basic curiosity. All right, save the gallery HTML, save the script, save the CSS. Let's head over to our gallery page in the browser and head over to our console. Okay, so presumably, if everything went right, when I click on one of the thumbnails, I will run this function and it will log the event for me. Let's see. Perfect. So I clicked on one, I clicked on another, I clicked on another. So you'll see that the event is a click, right? So those are the 3 events that have been printed out onto the console. And the very first thing that we see is that the event has a target. It actually tells me what was the element that was clicked. Okay, there's other information in there, right? A lot of other information. But again, type is click. There's a timestamp information, right? That you might want to print out, like at what exact time that happened, if you're interested. That's just something that came up in last video. And then the target. The target is the important thing for us. So let's save it. Let's call it thumb, right? And that's going to be event.target. So this is hopefully already kind of like a familiar paradigm, that dot notation, right? So something inside something else will be accessed through the dot, right? So if I know about the event and that event contains the target, I can access that target by saying event.target. Okay, cool. And then besides that, we can even get the source of that target. So we can, since it's an image, right? We can say .src, and then thumb src. That's going to be our source for the thumb, or image source, or however you call it. Doesn't necessarily matter, right? And so what we can do, since our thumbs and our images are actually have the same source, right? They just displayed smaller, right? But it's actually the same image. I can just simply say sc image source is the thumb source. Okay, cool. Let's, is it that simple? Really? Maybe. Let's see. So I click on this. I click on this. Oh, wow, it's changed. I click on this. It's changed. It's changed. Here we go. The basic functionality is there. Let's complicate things. I like to complicate things. No, but we're just going to try a few other things, and we're going to try and make it maybe a little bit more robust and see how, by adding some features and making it maybe a little bit more user-friendly, we're also encountering some problems, and how can we solve some of these problems. Okay? All right, so the basic functionality is there. I want to add a few things. So let's start with adding this. Well, first of all, I want to make sure that I highlight the thumbnail which is being currently displayed. Okay, not a particularly difficult task. So what I can do, I can say the list item that is currently being displayed, I'm gonna give it a special class called current thumb. Okay, so in the beginning, right, we're displaying gallery image 1, so the current thumb is going to be the thumbnail with the gallery image 1, right? So we need to go back to the CSS and we need to write some style for it, and nothing super fancy. I'm just going to give it a background color, right? So right here, I'm going to say dot current dash thumb. background color is going to be, oh, I don't know, rosy brown. There you go. That's a little color that is part of the CSS standard, rosy brown. Okay. All right. So let's save this. Let's go back to here. Reload. We have rosy brown. Now, when I click here, I want this image to not be highlighted anymore, and this image, this thumbnail, to be highlighted. Highlighted, whatever. So how do we approach this? How do we do this? So we need to somehow keep track of which image is being currently displayed. Okay, so and then also we need the ability to manipulate the classes that are being that our elements are being assigned to. All right, let's actually start with the second task first. In my script, as we're changing thumb, we also want to say something like this. So the event target, right? Event dot target refers, if you remember, to the image, right? It's the image that's being clicked on, right? Let's just double check again. Console.log event target, save. Let's reload. Console, click on this. It is the image, right? But the class needs to be applied to the list item, to this, right? Because the image won't have any kind of background, right? It's the container of the image that will have the background. So what we need to do, we need to access the parent element of our image, right? And so by the grace of the JavaScript standard, we do have access to the parent element. It's just dot parent element, just like we access the source, we can access the parent element of it. Okay, so we basically need to say event.target dot parent element. Dot class list. So then we have we have access to the list of classes that are added to the parent element, and then we need to add one more class, but instead of active, our class name is current dash thumb. Okay. All right, let's save this. Click. Aha, it's working, but we need to start removing the class from the element that's no longer being displayed, right? So if I click here, this is correct. This needs to be removed. Okay, and so there is a sleight of hand that happens here. So I don't need to actually think about which element was displayed before, right? Because it doesn't matter if I remove the class from this one or from this one or from that one. So the sleight of hand here is that what we're going to do before we assign the class to our newly clicked thumb image, I'm going to remove the class from all of them, right? I don't care if it's 1, 2, 3, or 4. Let's remove that class from all of them. The good thing is that when we're removing that class, if the class is not there, right? Like for example, in the case of image 4, the class is not there, it's not going to give you an error. It's just, I tried to remove it, the class wasn't there, so I moved on. All I care about is that that class is not there anymore. Done. Right? So what we're going to do, we're going to go through all of them, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and remove it. So in order to do something like this, we have what's known as a for loop, right? We could potentially say something like GT1, remove, GT2, get the parent, remove, GT3, get the parent, remove. And that's super tedious, and see how you start repeating yourself over and over and over again. And I promise that I'm going to show you how to not repeat yourself over and over again. In order to avoid that repetition, right? kind of like sweeping blank statements, all of the thumbs will have to lose that element, right? Or that class, right? We basically need to, the final sort of like line will be whatever it is, right? Like that element dot something. So we're gonna have um, something, and we'll change that dot parent element dot class list remove current thumb, right? So like we are the target of the event, its parent element is gonna gain that class. All those other ones will lose it, right? One by one. And so the reason why I'm kind of like going around about way of explaining this, so let's get to the meat and potatoes. We're gonna create, rather than addressing them one by one, we're gonna create a list, something called an array, right? So this is a data structure inside JavaScript, inside vast majority of programming languages. An array contains a collection of things. So we are gonna get a collection with 4 elements in it, right? Gallery thumb 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? And we can do that the following way. So I'm gonna, first of all, I'm gonna comment this out. I'm just gonna leave it in the document, but I'm just gonna comment it out so it doesn't affect anything. And I'm gonna comment this out, right? So I'm kind of breaking a couple of things here, but I am going to say this: let thumb images, right? That's going to be my collection. And thumb images, I'm going to access all of the images using a function called query selector. So I'm going to say document dot query selector all. So I need to select all of the elements that match my query. And the query is going to, and you can use CSS queries here, CSS addressing formula, right? So I'm going to say dot gallery thumb, right? So an element with a class gallery thumb, right? Here they are. I have 4 of them. Dot gallery thumb, and then I want to access an image that is a direct child of it, right? So remember that arrow means direct child, not a grandchild, not a great grandchild, but directly a child of this gallery thumb. And gallery thumb refers to my list items, and then the image is going to be the actual image. So here's my collection of images. Okay, as always, let's console log to double check. Reload. I have a node list. That's the array. And I have 0, 1, 2, and 3. So all arrays start with 0, always and forever, right? So the first element in the array will always be number 0, then number 1, number 2, and number 3. That is a very important thing that you always have to remember. And then the length of this array is obviously 4, right? And each one of them refers to the image that the reference to which we grabbed. So we have a node list, right? A special array with 4 elements, 0, 1, 2, and 3. So now we can operate on all of those images one by one, right? So first of all, we commented out all these event listeners. That won't do. We need to add those event listeners back, okay? But this time, so I'm going to show you 2 ways of doing this. I'm going to show you a for loop and a for each function. So see, the assistant is offering me a for each function. So I'm going to first show you the for loop, and then I'm going to show you the for each function. Fundamentally, they do the same thing, but for loop offers you a little bit more flexibility. So I'm going to say for, and the for loop starts with an index, right? Or an iterator, however you want to call it. Usually it's just a small variable, temporary variable called I. And I want this, let's call it an iterator. I want this iterator to be 0 in the beginning, okay? And then for as long as I is less than thumb images dot length. Okay, so here it already wrote it for me. So we'll start with I equals 0, and for as long as I is less than the length of thumb images. So the length of thumb images, if you remember, is 4, right? So here it is, length 4. So as long as that I is less than 4, I'm going to do something and then change that I. So what I'm going to do is going to be between the curly brackets, right? So that's going to be the action that I'm going to be performing. And then the change of the I is going to happen here. And so we're encountering something that looks like I++. And that's true, it's I++. And what it stands for, it's a shorthand. And it stands for I equals I plus 1, right? It's an equivalent statement. So it's just a shorthand. So now that you've seen what it stands for, let's just bring it back to I++, a very, very common shorthand. You will see it everywhere. So what that means is I'm going to start with I equals 0. Then I'm going to move on to I being 1. Then I will be 2. Then it will be 3. And at that point, when it's going to try to move to 4, it's going to violate this condition, right? That it has to be less than the length. That it can be 0, 1, 2, 3, but it cannot be 4, right? So we're going to break out of that loop, okay? So this is a great way that allows us to address each one of those thumb images. First number 0, then number 1, then number 2, then number 3. So in order to address them, notice how in the console they were printed between the square brackets, right? So there's this square bracket notation associated with an array, okay? So square brackets just simply denote either the entire contents of the array, or you can use the same square bracket notation to address each element of the array. So I would use that square bracket and put in the number for the element that I'm trying to access. So first it's going to be 0. I'm going to access element number 0. Then it's going to be 1. Then it's going to be 2. Then it's going to be 3. So I'm going to access each one of those elements that way, and then add an event listener to it called click. And the function that will be executed will be change image. Okay. All right. Fantastic. So another thing I can do, I can provide a shorthand, right? So I can so let's rewrite this in a minute. I can encapsulate this. I think let's postpone this, and let's, before we get to that, let's look at the for each option. Okay, so let's save this for now. Comment this line out because that might give me an error, right? And then see if our functionality is back. Let's reload. Our functionality is back where we left it off, right? The images are working, just the classes are not being removed. They're constantly being added, this current thumb class, right? So let's resolve this issue and do the sleight of hand that I promised, right? So we are going to say that thumb images dot for each. So for each is a special function that all arrays have access to, and it fundamentally performs the same thing that we did in this for loop. So the big difference between for each and for loop is that for each will go through each and every single element in the array, one by one. For loop will allow you to skip one, right? So I don't have to say I++ here, right? Which is I equals I plus 1. I can say I plus 2, right? I can say go 0, and then 2, and then let's say 4, 6, 8, right? If we had a large enough array, I could, for example, separate the even and the odd numbered components that way, right? So I have a lot more flexibility in how I'm traversing my for loop. For each is less powerful, but it's quicker, right? So in the vast majority of cases, we are most likely just going to be iterating through every single component in our array. So that's why for each is kind of a shorthand for the for loop that goes through every single component. Okay, so for each will take a function, right? And that function will have a reference for each one of those component, and it will call it something. Thumb or T or element, doesn't matter, right? So I'm going to call it lm for the element of the array. And so I'm going to say for each and every single one of them, this element, we're going to access its parent element, right? Because this is, we grab the images. And so if we need to access the list item, we need to grab the parent element of that list item, go to its class list, and remove the current thumb. Current thumb class, right? So this is fundamentally what we were planning to write all along, right? It's just that something was actually each and every element in the array of elements that we identified. Okay, so let's remove this. Let's make sure we are closing all of our curlies and parens. So right now I have an error, right? So this event is curly, it has a curly underline, and that is because I'm actually not closing everything, right? And that's where indentation will definitely be helpful. But also let's count, right? So I'm highlighting the closing and the opening curly right here. So this is, if I put it to the closing one, it also highlights the opening automatically. Same with parentheses, right? I highlights the closing parentheses and the opening one, right? And it goes the other way around too. So you will notice that while I'm opening and closing the parentheses around the elements, I am opening the parentheses near the function, but I'm never closing it, right? So curly is being closed here. This one's being closed here, but this parenthesis is never getting closed, and it needs to be, right? So I am going to close it right here, and my error disappeared. So pay attention to opening and closing parentheses and curlies. It can get a little tricky, and you might need to kind of slow down a little bit and go through and make sure that everything is where it's supposed to be. But after a little while, it kind of, you'll get used to it. All right, so let's see if it worked out. So are we removing the current thumb classes from the elements where we don't want to have them? Let's reload the page. Click. Oops. Click. Right, so every time I click on the next one, it goes through all of them, removes it, or in other words, makes sure that not a single one of them has it, right? And then assigns it, right? Adds to the one that I just clicked on. So there we go. Okay, that's a helpful functionality. And then another thing that I wanted to add is a common functionality in galleries, right? That allows you to move the images to the next, to the next, to the next, and to the next, right? So typically you would have like a little arrow here and a little arrow here. And if you click on it, it goes to the next one, it goes to the next one, and it goes to the next one. So let's see if we can do that, right? And I want to also reconcile it with this, right? I want to make sure that I'm synchronizing both ways to traverse the gallery, okay? All right, so I need arrows. I need to have those arrows that I would be able to click on back and forth. And so my go-to tool for all kinds of icons to use on the web is Font Awesome, right? Font Awesome is a collection of icons that you can use, right? And you can search through them and sort of like figure out what it is that you want. So let's search for an arrow. Okay, so here we go. I have arrow right and arrow left. So some of them are hidden on the pro version, right? And you have to pay for it. But arrow right here is free. And arrow left, I can also look for arrow left, it's there. That's also going to be free. So if I click on this, it's going to give me several options, right? HTML, which is not going to work just outside, right? You actually have to include some libraries. React and Vue are the templating engines that we haven't looked at, and if you're interested, come to me and I can talk to you about this. But I'm gonna grab an SVG. SVG, hopefully you're familiar with the format. It's scalable vector graphics. So scalable vector graphics is a format for graphics that describes the simple shape in terms of numbers, in terms of how they're supposed to be drawn. So if you look at what exactly is inside of SVG, right, you will see that it kind of like describes the path, right? And it describes it in terms of positions of the next, the next, the next, and this is how the path should be drawn. It's basically just a bunch of numbers, okay? So more on the SVG format is out there in Google. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to copy the code snippet, copy this SVG, and I can insert SVG directly into HTML. So I want my arrows to sit on top of my thumbnail or a showcase image, right? So what I need to do in order to facilitate this is use a property of CSS called positioning, right? And so I'm going to have a div right here, another component, and I'm gonna put it right underneath the image, right? And that div is gonna have a class, and that's gonna be showcase arrow, right? And then showcase arrow, I believe right, yeah, since we have the right arrow. And then I'm gonna paste my SVG here, right? So this is the definition of SVG, this is the path, this is where it came from. Fantastic. And then I will do the same thing for the left arrow. So I'm gonna copy this, put it under, and then change it to left. And then I'm gonna go to Font Awesome and find my left arrow. Should be somewhere, let's see. Here's my arrow left, SVG, copied. We copied the code snippet, and I'm gonna paste this here. Okay. Fantastic. So if I save this, and I'm gonna go to my page, right, you will have a massive arrow right here and massive arrow right below. The reason for that is because SVG is scalable vector graphics, right? It doesn't matter how big you make them, they're never going to get pixelated. That's the beauty of it, so it's easily scalable, but I don't want them to look like this. I want them a lot smaller, and this is why I added the classes to my divs. I'm actually going to constrain their size, and I'm going to position them on top of the image. All right, so for that, I don't need JavaScript. I just need a little bit of extra CSS, right? So where's my image showcase? So image showcase, let's add dot showcase arrow, right? So all of those showcase arrows are going to be pretty much the same. Well, both of them are going to be pretty much the same. There's going to be just slight difference between the left and the right. Obviously, the right is going to be on the right. The left is going to be on the left. And so that's why I have like one class for both of them that is going to contain the vast majority of the properties. And then the property that's going to be actually slightly different, I'm going to add into the second class. Okay, so both of them need to have a constrained width, right? So, and height, size, basically, right? So let's set the width to be, and these are numbers that I played around with, and I figured out what looks all right. So I'm gonna say width is 48 pixel and height is 58 pixels. Okay, pixels, don't forget the pixels, right? So that's great. And then, yeah, so let's start there. Let's save this. Let's look at the, okay, reasonably sized arrows. So now I need to position them over here and over here. In order to do this, I said we're going to be using the CSS positioning property. And so there is a kind of like a formula, a standard way of doing this. We're not going to get into all kinds of positioning strategies, but I can set the place of one element in relation to the other element, right? So in this case, I can set the position of my arrow in relation to the image showcase in relation to its parent, its immediate parent. If I set the position property of the parent to relative and the position property of the arrow to absolute. Okay, so if I do it this way, let's just see what happens, right? So right now they're kind of on top of each other underneath the parent, right? So something changed very subtly, but we need to make a few more changes in order for it to take effect. So first of all, I want them about 50% from the top of the parent, right? So let's go into the inspector. So here's our parent, and I want it about 50% from the top of the parent, right? So I can say that my arrow top property is going to be set to 50%. Okay, so 50%. Let's reload. Here they are at 50%. And then I can give them a little bit of background color. I can give them a little bit of margins and stuff like this. So let's do the following. Let's do margin. Actually, let's start with background color. Background color. Let's make it like a reasonable gray, but I also want to add transparency, right? So that I can see a little bit of the image underneath. So I'm going to do RGBA, A for the alpha channel, right? And I'm going to set it to be, let's say 150, 150, 150, and 0.3. Yeah, so the transparency is a value between 0 and 1. So 0.3 will give me 30% transparency. And then I'm going to give them a bit of a padding. Padding, 8 pixels. Why not? Pixels, if I can only spell this correctly. Let's see how it goes. All right, so I have 2 of them, and they have a certain transparency. So right now they're on top of each other. So in order to fix that, I would need to move one to the right and one to the left. And so one way to do this is to set the left property of my left arrow to be 0, right? Just like I can set the top property of something that's absolutely positioned, right? I can set the left and the right property. And so the left arrow is going to be 0 pixels on the left, and the right arrow is going to be 0 pixels on the right. So let's save this, reload. Here we go. So they're a little bit tacked out simply because we have a padding around the showcase image, right? So we need to fix this, and we can fix it by adding some margins, right? So margins can be helpful, right? So first if you might already found that out, or if not, you are about to find out, the margins can be negative, right? So a positive margin will make some extra space. The negative margin will kind of like move the element offside in the space, right? So I would need to set, for example, for this particular element, right, I would need to set the margin to be negative 8 pixels. Okay, so actually, sorry, no, 8 pixels. Yeah, there we go. So that aligns it, but where the negative margin comes in and I knew I would need a negative margin, is if I zoom out from this page, you will see that it's actually not quite centered. And that's because that 50% from the top applies to the top left corner of my element, right? So I am going to be adding, I want to use the negative margins in order to push it up by about half of its size, right? So here it's 58 pixels tall, so I'm going to do minus 29. And that's going to push it up a little bit, and now it's actually perfectly in the center. Okay, so just to be quite pedantic about this. So overall, I can set the margins on the left and on the right to be 8 pixels, right, for both of them. And then for both of them, the top margin will have to be minus 29 pixels. All right, so let's reset the zoom. Let's reload the page and go record those values. So in the showcase arrow, I'm going to set margin, right? And if you remember, I can set top, right, bottom, and left margins sequentially under the same property. So I'm going to say minus 29 pixels, 8 pixels, 0, and 8 pixels. Okay. So those are going to be my my margin values, right? Let's save this, reload. All right, so my arrows are working. Now I should be able to address them in JavaScript. And every time I click on one or the other, I want to progress my current image by one, either to the left or to the right. Okay? All right, let's try and see how we can write this out. So first of all, let's address my arrows, right? We already saw that there's a query selector option. So let's use that to grab my arrows without having to assign IDs to them. So query selector all will return a list. Even if there's only one element on the page, with this that responds to this particular query, it's going to be a list with one element in it. But query selector, so without the all, will return the first member of that class, the very first one it encounters on the page. So since I know that I only have one showcase arrow right and only one showcase arrow left, I can use that peculiarity of my query selectors and say let arrow right be, so document dot query selector showcase arrow right, and don't forget the dot because this is how you address classes, right? Showcase arrow right, and then arrow left is going to be the same thing, but with left. So let's copy and paste and change the relevant things. So arrow left, showcase arrow left. Perfect. All right. So also, we're going to have to keep track of what sort of like what's the number of the currently selected image and whether we should be advancing to the left or to the right. So kind of like keeping track of where we are in this chain, in this queue of images, right? So we have 0, 1, 2, 3, and then after 3 we have to go back to 0, and so we kind of have this loop, and we need to figure out where we are in this loop. So since the very first thumbnail that we're showing is the first one, our index in that queue is going to be 0, right? So let's say current index thumb thumb is 0. Fantastic, right? So next, what we're going to do is we need to assign event listeners. That's always the case to our arrow right and arrow left, right? So let's do arrow right dot add event listener. Okay, and again, we're listening for a click. Okay, and then here we can write out the function right away. We don't have to create an external one like the change image. We're going to say function. Okay, and then this is where we might change our change image event a little bit just for the convenience sake. Okay, so first of all, when I click on the right arrow to the right over there, I'm going to advance it by 1, right? So from 0 to 1. So let's start there. Let's say current index thumb, and let's make sure it's actually spelled correctly. So we already sorted the shorthand by advance by 1, or like add 1. It's just going to be plus plus. Okay. After that, we need to account for the situation that what if we are reaching the edge, the end of our list, right? So remember, our thumb images array has 4 images, right? So we can select 0, 1, 2, 3, but the moment we advance to 4, we're going out of bounds of our array. That's the technical term. And 4 technically should bring us back to 0, right? So this is where a conditional statement would be very useful. And we can say something like this. If current index thumb is greater or equal to thumb images dot length, right? So technically we're accounting for a situation where current index thumb is equal to 4, the length of the images, right? If it's 4, it needs to become 0. But we're saying greater or equal to potentially, possibly accounting for a situation where somehow, by some weird grace of God's, old and new, we jump from 3 to 5 or to 7, or it's God knows what number, right? So as long as it's the same as the length, so 4, or greater even, how that happened, we don't care, we'll reset it back to 0. Okay? So we reset it back to 0, and then we need to say, well, show that thumbnail that we are currently indexing, right? So it'd be great to have something like change image, right? And then just pass the image to it, right? Change image to this image, right? And we can, right? So let's assume that we're going to change it this way. So we're going to say change image, and then we're going to say from images, right? That's our list of images. And then current index thumb. Okay. So unfortunately, currently our function doesn't work like this. It takes in the event instead of the reference to the image, but we can rewrite it. So in order to rewrite it, what we need to do is, instead of right here, when we are saying like whenever you click on this thing, right, just trigger this function, right? Because if you do it this way, the only thing that this function will know about is the event that triggered it, right? And that's why we're passing it over here. If you wanted to have more information, you can nest a function inside a function. So I can say something like this. Instead of directly triggering it, I can say function, and then change image, and then pass the image into it, right? So basically saying like, I'm going to have the event is going to be passed over here, event, and then the target of that event dot target is going to be passed over there, right? So this is basically how JavaScript would understand a command like this. I think kind of like getting a little bit philosophical, it's about the differences in the way different languages express different statements, right? So like, just like one thing that can be said very succinctly in let's say English, right, might require whole construction in French or in German. So is something that we can say in English very plainly requires somewhat a construction in JavaScript because of how the constraints um, are placed within the language and how the sort of what are the options you have when you're making one statement or another, right? So okay, so now in here I'm not going to be actually using event. This is going to be image, so I'm going to say underscore image, right? It's just kind of a little shorthand that I use for myself to remind myself that this is just something that's being passed into a function. So I'm going to say, instead of event target, it's going to be image.source. And then, right? Because we no longer need to say event and then target. And then we already have the event target. That's the image. And the image source is going to be the thumb source. And then we're going to assign that to the showcase image. That's fantastic. And then similarly here, right? We don't need to say event target. We can just say image dot parent element. Okay. So fantastic. So this has become a little bit more universal, right? We can now use it in different contexts. It became a little bit more complicated, true, but a little bit more powerful as well, right? So now we can easily say change image and then pass the image that we want to change to, okay? And then we can do the same thing for the left arrow, only we're gonna have to do it the other way, right? So we instead of counting what happens when we reach the top of the array size, right? Like 4 or more, we're gonna have to figure out what happens when we reach less than 0, right? When we get to like -1, because 0 we can display, but -1 doesn't exist. All right, so array left, again, add event listener. It's going to be a click and it's going to be a function that's going to be triggered on that click. Let's not forget the closing parentheses there. And then we're going to obviously subtract 1 from the current index thumb. Index thumb minus minus. You might have guessed that, right? So if plus plus adds 1, minus minus subtracts 1. And then we can say if current index thumb is less than 0. So 0 is still okay. But if we're going below 0, right, we need to switch not to 4, but to 3, right? Because we have 0, 1, 2, and 3. So if we are displaying 0 now and we're moving to the left of 0, we need to switch back to 3. All right, so it's going to be thumb images dot length -1. So 4 minus 1, that gives you the index of the lost element in the array, right? And then we are, again, saying change image. I think I made a spelling error over here and over there, and it's very typical for me to make tons of spelling errors and then try and figure out why things are not working. So thumb images, and then in square brackets, current image thumb again. Okay, so we have written out this whole thing without even trying if it still works. That should be a scary prospect. We should have tried at least a few more times along the way. So let's hope we didn't make any errors. Let's go to console, reload the page, and see if it still works. The top navigation still works. What about the arrows? The arrows still work. That's fantastic, right? So here we go, here we go, here we go, here we go. So there is one thing that is not actually quite written in here, and you might have noticed it. So if I switch to 3 over here, right, and then click to the left, it actually moves 2. Well, why is that? Right? You can pause, you can ponder, you can think a little bit, but the reason for that is because our current index thumb is only being advanced to certain position when we click on the arrows. If we're not clicking on the arrows, we're not changing that index, right? So if I'm making a selection from my thumbnails, I'm not advancing it. So if it's here, right, it actually is like let's reload the page again. If it's here, it's going to go back because it was 0 and now it became 1, even though the actual image was image number 3, right? So there are different ways of figuring that out, right? And then one way of doing this is to try and figure out what's the index of the current image in the array, right? So the way to do this is to, just like we have the math, sort of like collection of math functionalities, we also have a collection of array functionalities, right? So current index thumb is equal to, let's address that whole big component that relates to various array functionalities. And so dot from the array thumb images, right? So we're going to look at the array thumb images, and we're going to see what's the index of the current image, the image that we are passing into this function, okay? And then we're going to set the current index thumb to be that, right? Whatever it is that we're passing into it, okay? So if we're using our arrows, right, we're going to switch to image 2, for example, and then we're going to look, oh, the image that we selected is 2, so let's set the current index thumb to 2. Oh, it's already 2. Okay, don't worry about it, right? So we are advancing it here, and then we're resetting it a little bit later here, so it's going to be set to the same place. All good. And if we're using the top thumbnails, right, then we're going to be switching it to whatever is the placement of this current image that we're displaying in the array thumb images, right? So how could you have figured that out on your own is an important question. And one way to do it is to Google it, right? And try and figure out how to figure out the index of an element in an array, right? If you Google for this, you'll probably, after poking around, you'll find something out, right? Don't forget to add JavaScript to this. The other option is just kind of like be aware that there are certain possibilities out there, right? So some things are possible, and all you have to do is just sort of like, oh, I know that I can get an index of a thing from the array. If I don't remember exactly how to do that, that's okay. I can always Google for it. All right, let's see if it fixed it, right? Let's see if this actually did what we expected to do. Okay, let's save this, reload, and then we're going to switch over here. And then if I move to the, if I click on the arrow right, I want it to go to image 4 instead of image 2 the way it used to. And it actually did, right? So, all right, a little bit of like complicated, where you have to start figuring out little things, little bits and pieces here and there. But hopefully this was a good illustration of how you can approach sort of strategy around JavaScript. What are some of the things that are possible? What are some of the tricks that you might want to employ? And yeah, this is how it's typically being used. One thing that you can give yourself a challenge with, and I'm not going to cover it right now, but you can try, see if you can figure out yet another level of complexity in the gallery. And then instead of selecting it from the thumbnails, or advancing it with the arrows left and right, add one more way of advancing it, and it is by a timer. So let's say every time the next 2 seconds pass, right? Every 2 seconds, it just advances from 0 to 1, from 1 to 2, from 2 to 3, from 3 back to 0, and it just kind of like goes on an interval. And interval here is a key operating word. This is what you should be looking for if you're Googling for things, how to set intervals in JavaScript and how to use intervals in JavaScript. Okay, try it out, see if it works, and hopefully you'll have some fun with it. All right, cheers, till next time.